The fire roared like a living beast, its hungry flames swallowing the grand mansion whole. Thick, black smoke billowed into the sky, choking out the stars. A growing crowd of onlookers stood helplessly in the cold night air, their faces illuminated by the flickering orange glow. Sirens wailed in the distance, still too far. The fire department wouldn't make it in time. And then came the scream. A child's cry. Somewhere inside that inferno, a little girl was trapped. The onlookers shifted uneasily, whispering, pointing, but none moved. The fire had already spread too far, too fast. Then, he stepped forward. The man looked out of place among the well-dressed onlookers. His clothes were worn, his shoes tattered, his face covered in a rough, unshaven beard. He smelled of the streets, of cold nights and empty stomachs. A homeless man, the kind people walked past without a second glance. His gaze locked onto the burning house, then to the faces in the crowd. Nobody was moving. Nobody was going in. The child screamed again. Without a word, he ran. Straight toward the flames. The crowd gasped as he sprinted past them, his breath visible in the cold night air. A woman reached out, as if to stop him. Someone shouted, "Don't. You'll never make it out." But he didn't stop. His legs carried him faster than he had moved in years. Not toward shelter, not toward food, but toward the fire, toward danger. The heat struck him first, like a scorching wall. Smoke clawed at his throat. His eyes stung. But he kept going, forcing his way through the crumbling doorway. Inside, the mansion was an inferno. Flames licked the walls, devouring expensive furniture and priceless art. The air was thick with heat, making every breath feel like inhaling fire. He stumbled forward, shielding his face, listening for her. Another cry. Weak, but close. He followed the sound, moving deeper into the house. His hands brushed against burning wood, his feet kicking aside fallen debris. He had to keep going. The girl was in here somewhere. Alone. Outside, the onlookers stood frozen in shock. A homeless man had just run into a burning house to save a child. Would he make it out? Would they ever see him again? Or had he just thrown his life away for nothing? The moment he crossed the threshold, the fire welcomed him like an unforgiving beast. Heat rolled over his skin, scorching his clothes. Smoke filled his lungs, burning his throat, forcing a ragged cough from deep in his chest. The wooden floor beneath him groaned under the fire's relentless assault. He pushed forward. The girl's cries were faint, barely audible over the crackling flames. He turned a corner and stumbled into a grand hallway, what was once a masterpiece of wealth and luxury, now a nightmare of flickering firelight and collapsing walls. Where was she? His heartbeat pounded in his ears, each second feeling longer than the last. He had to move fast. He ducked low, remembering something. Smoke rises. Years ago, when his life was different, he had learned this. A different man, in a different time. A past he had tried to forget. Another cough racked his body as he pushed forward, sweeping his gaze across the burning wreckage. Then, his foot caught on something. He stumbled but caught himself against the charred remains of a couch. A child's stuffed bear. Half burned, lying forgotten on the floor. A rush of adrenaline hit him. She's close. Hey, he shouted, his voice hoarse. I'm here. Call out to me. Silence. Then, a faint whimper. He turned sharply, eyes narrowing toward a doorway barely visible through the thickening smoke. The door itself was partially burned, its wooden frame blackened, but it was still intact. He lunged toward it, grabbed the handle, searing pain shot through his palm. He yanked his hand back, cursing under his breath. The metal was burning hot. Think. A tattered cloth lay nearby. He grabbed it, wrapped it around his hand, and tried again. The handle resisted at first, but then, with a hard shove, the door burst open. Inside, curled up under a wooden desk, was a little girl. She clutched her knees to her chest, eyes wide with terror, her cheeks streaked with soot. She couldn't have been older than 6. The fire's glow reflected in her tear-filled eyes as she gazed at him, frozen in fear. She thinks I'm a stranger. He knelt, keeping his voice calm despite the chaos around them. I'm here to help. You have to come with me, okay? She didn't move. Another chunk of the ceiling groaned overhead. A flaming beam snapped, crashing into the room behind him. He didn't have time for this. He moved closer, reaching out a hand. I know you're scared. But I need you to trust me. The little girl clutched her bear tighter, her lip trembling. His chest tightened. How many times had he begged for someone to trust him? How many times had the world turned its back on him? This time, he wouldn't turn his back on her. Another loud crack. The flames were closing in. If they didn't move now, neither of them would make it out alive. The fire roared louder, angry at his hesitation. The heat was unbearable now, licking at his skin, making it harder to think. No more waiting. No more chances. He lunged forward, wrapping the little girl in his arms. She let out a startled gasp but didn't resist, her tiny fingers clung to his soot-covered shirt. Now, the hard part. The room was closing in on them. Smoke curled around his head, suffocating him, making his limbs heavy. He had to move, now. He turned toward the doorway, only to see a wall of flames erupt in front of him. No. The only way out, the same way he came in, was gone. Completely engulfed. His pulse hammered against his ribs. Think, think, think. The fire was spreading fast, eating through the structure like a starving beast. Every second they stayed, the building became a death trap. He looked around frantically. The windows. But they were covered with heavy curtains, now burning. If he smashed through, the girl could get cut, but they didn't have a choice. The mansion groaned under the fire's pressure. He didn't know how much longer the house would stand. He tightened his grip on the child and sprinted toward the window. A loud crack above. His instincts screamed at him to move faster. A second later, the ceiling gave way. Boom! A chunk of burning wood slammed down behind them, missing them by inches. The shockwave nearly sent him stumbling forward, but he caught himself, barely. The girl let out a frightened whimper, her tiny fingers digging into his shirt. It's okay, he rasped, even though it wasn't. He reached the window. The heat was unbearable now. The glass was cracked but still holding. Close your eyes, he whispered to the girl. She obeyed. With one final breath, he turned and threw his elbow forward. Crash! Glass exploded outward, shards raining down onto the burning floor. A gust of fresh air rushed inside, mixing with the suffocating smoke. He lifted the girl, checking the outside drop. It wasn't far. But it wasn't safe, either. The ground below was lined with debris, but if he angled it right. The girl clung to his chest, her small body trembling. I'm scared, she whispered. He swallowed. So am I. Then, he jumped. For a moment, time froze, the fire, the heat, the choking smoke, all of it disappeared. And then, impact. His back slammed into the cold, hard ground, pain exploding through his ribs. He barely managed to twist midair to protect the girl from the worst of the fall. His lungs screamed in agony. But, she was safe. The little girl let out a soft whimper, but she was alive. He tried to push himself up, but his body refused. Pain radiated from his leg, sharp, burning, unbearable. Something was wrong. Above them, the house shuddered. Flames curled out of the shattered window, consuming the walls, creeping closer to total collapse. He needed to get out of the way. But his leg wasn't moving. Outside, people were screaming. The girl clutched his shirt. "Mister. Please get up." His breath was ragged, vision blurring. Was this how it ended? Had he saved her, only to be left behind? The fire roared like an enraged beast, swallowing the mansion whole. The structure groaned under its own weight, buckling as the flames consumed everything in their path. Lying on the cold, scorched ground, the homeless man fought to breathe. Every inhale was a struggle, his chest tightening, his vision swimming in and out of focus. His leg throbbed with blinding pain, he couldn't move it. But the girl was safe. She clung to his shirt, her small face buried in the soot-covered fabric. Her tiny frame trembled as she let out a broken sob. Above them, the house shuddered violently. It was coming down. A deafening crack split the air. The crowd watching from a safe distance screamed as the entire second floor collapsed inward. Flaming debris rained down around them, pieces of burning wood and shattered glass slamming into the ground just inches away. Smoke billowed out, thick and choking. He gritted his teeth and tried again. He had to move. His arms strained as he attempted to push himself up, but his body betrayed him. His leg was still useless, the pain burning deeper. Was it broken? A shadow loomed over him. Suddenly, hands gripped his arms. "Get him out of here." Voices. People. Someone was helping him. Strong arms hoisted him up, dragging him away from the collapse. He barely registered the feeling of cool night air on his skin as he was pulled farther from the fire's heat. The girl never let go of him, even as others tried to take her. She held onto his shirt with all her strength. "Sir, stay with me," a voice commanded. "Can you hear me?" He tried to respond. Nothing came out but a weak cough. The flames behind them raged one last time before the entire mansion gave way, collapsing into a fiery ruin. Silence. The once pristine home, a monument to wealth and power, was gone. He lay on the pavement, chest heaving, staring up at the night sky. The cold wind bit at his skin, but it was a welcome relief from the unbearable heat moments ago. He was alive. And so was she. A blurry figure appeared in his vision. A man in an expensive suit, his face twisted in horror. His daughter's father. The millionaire knelt beside them, trembling as he pulled his child into his arms. The girl clung to him, but her small hands still reached back, toward the homeless man. She didn't want to let go. "Daddy, he saved me," she whispered. "He saved me." The millionaire's eyes flickered with 1,000 emotions: shock, relief, disbelief. His gaze fell on the homeless man's burned, battered body. "You," the man whispered, voice thick with emotion. "You ran in there. You saved her." He barely had the strength to nod. Before another word could be said, paramedics rushed in, separating them. The last thing he heard before his vision faded to black, was the little girl calling his name. The world came back in fragments. First, the steady beeping of a heart monitor. Then, the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. And finally, the sharp sting of pain, a dull ache spreading through his limbs, a deep throb in his chest, and an unbearable fire searing through his leg. He was alive. His eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the sterile white walls of a hospital room. The sheets beneath his fingers were crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the filth and grime he had grown used to on the streets. How did I get here? His last memory was of fire. The girl. The collapse. Hands pulling him away. His breath hitched. Did she make it? He turned his head slightly, and froze. Across the room, sitting in a chair too big for her small frame, was her. The millionaire's daughter. She was wrapped in a soft pink blanket, her hair slightly disheveled but clean. She held the same half-burned teddy bear in her lap, gripping it tightly. The moment she saw him stir, her face lit up. "Mister! You're awake." Her voice, filled with relief, pierced through the fog in his mind. Before he could respond, the door swung open. A tall man in a pressed navy blue suit strode in, his face tense with emotion. The girl's father. The millionaire. For a moment, the two men just stared at each other. The homeless man shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to being seen. On the streets, people looked past him, through him. They didn't acknowledge him unless it was with pity or disdain. But now, this man was looking at him like he was someone who mattered. The millionaire cleared his throat. His voice was strained. I don't even know where to begin." The homeless man blinked, still struggling to find his own voice. His throat was dry, his body weak. "You ran into that fire," the millionaire continued, his voice thick. "No hesitation. No second thought. You saved my daughter's life." The little girl nodded eagerly, her grip on her teddy bear tightening. He had no words. "I need to know," the millionaire asked, stepping closer, his gaze searching. "Why? Why would you risk your life for a stranger?" The homeless man opened his mouth, but no words came. He wasn't sure how to answer. "Because she needed me? Because no one else was going to? Because I know what it's like to be left behind?" He settled on the simplest truth. "Because I could." The millionaire exhaled sharply, like he had been holding his breath. He nodded, as if that answer said more than any explanation ever could. A knock on the door broke the silence. A doctor and 2 police officers entered the room. "We need to speak with him," one of the officers said. The homeless man's stomach twisted. Had he done something wrong? Before he could ask, the doctor spoke first. "Your injuries are serious. A fractured leg, second-degree burns, and some smoke inhalation. But you'll recover." The officer stepped forward. "We need your name." His name. He hesitated. For years, his name hadn't mattered. On the streets, he was just another forgotten soul. Another face in the crowd. But as he looked at the little girl, the way she watched him like a hero, not a nobody, something inside him shifted. He swallowed hard. "It's Rowan," he said finally. His voice was hoarse, but steady. "Rowan Vance." The millionaire stiffened. The officers exchanged a glance. And in that moment, Rowan realized something was wrong. They knew his name. Before he could ask why, the millionaire's eyes darkened with recognition. His next words sent a shockwave through the room. "I know who you are." Rowan's breath caught in his throat. The millionaire's eyes burned with something, recognition, disbelief, and something darker. "I know who you are," the man repeated, his voice heavy with meaning. The little girl looked up at her father in confusion. "Daddy?" Rowan's pulse pounded in his ears. What did he mean? How could he possibly know him? The officer on the left shifted uncomfortably, glancing between them. "Mr. Vance, is this true? Do you know each other?" Rowan clenched his fists against the hospital sheets. His mind was racing, reaching back through the years of his old life, the one he had buried beneath the weight of regret and bad choices. The millionaire, he looked familiar now. Not just familiar. He knew exactly who this man was. "Your name," Rowan whispered. His throat was raw, but the words came out anyway. "You're Cade Arlo." The millionaire, Cade, nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. The air in the room shifted, growing thick with unspoken history. Rowan knew Cade Arlo because years ago, they had stood on the same side of life. Rowan hadn't always been homeless. He hadn't always been forgotten. Once, he had been one of them. A successful businessman. A respected name. A rising star in the corporate world. And Cade Arlo had been his business partner. The little girl, still sitting at the foot of Rowan's hospital bed, looked between them, confused. "Daddy? You know him?" Cade exhaled sharply, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. He looked torn, like he didn't know whether to be grateful or furious. "We were," Cade hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. Finally, he settled on, "We worked together. A long time ago." The room was silent. Rowan felt the old wounds reopen, the memories he had tried so hard to forget flooding back. He and Cade had built something together. A business, a future. They had both been young, ambitious, and unstoppable. Until Rowan made one mistake. A bad investment. A financial risk that went south. A fall from grace so severe that no one, not even Cade, had stood by him. He had lost everything. And now, years later, covered in scars and dressed in a hospital gown instead of $1,000 suit, he was sitting face to face with the man who had once called him a friend. Cade's expression was unreadable. "I thought you were dead?" Rowan finished bitterly. Cade's jaw clenched, but he didn't deny it. The officers exchanged another glance. "We were told to investigate Mr. Vance's background after the fire, standard protocol. But we didn't expect to find," the cop trailed off, but the meaning was clear. Rowan Vance wasn't just some homeless man anymore. He was someone people used to know. The millionaire's daughter scooted closer, her small voice cutting through the heavy silence. "Mr. Rowan? If you knew my daddy, why didn't you tell him?" Rowan swallowed. "Because it doesn't matter." She frowned. "Why not?" He looked at her, this little girl who shouldn't be alive, but was, because of him. Because he had acted. Because when everyone else had hesitated, he had run into the fire. He glanced back at Cade, whose gaze was still unreadable. "I'm not the man I used to be," Rowan murmured. Cade studied him for a long moment. Then, with a deep breath, he turned to the officers. "He doesn't need an investigation. He saved my daughter's life. That's all anyone needs to know." The officers hesitated before nodding. "Understood, Mr. Arlo." When they left, Rowan let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. But Cade wasn't done. "You saved my daughter," Cade said quietly. His voice was softer now, no longer just the composed, distant voice of a billionaire. "And for that, I owe you more than I can ever repay." Rowan frowned. "I don't want anything." "I know," Cade said. "But I want to make you an offer anyway." Rowan stiffened. He didn't know what Cade was about to say. But he wasn't ready for it. Rowan's body tensed as Cade Arlo sat down beside his hospital bed, his expression unreadable. The air between them was thick, a mix of gratitude, regret, and something deeper. Cade folded his hands together, his sharp business instincts kicking in, even now. "I don't expect you to accept anything from me," he started, his voice measured. "But I owe you, Rowan. More than I can ever repay." Rowan sighed, shifting slightly against the pillows. "I told you, I don't want anything." Cade shook his head. "That's not the point. You saved my daughter's life. If you hadn't run into that fire," his voice hitched, and for the first time, the mask of a powerful billionaire cracked. "If you hadn't been there, I would have lost her." Rowan looked away, his jaw tightening. He wasn't sure how to respond to that. "Let me help you," Cade pressed, leaning forward. "I have connections. I can get you back on your feet, set you up with a job, a place to stay." No, the word came out faster than Rowan expected. Cade blinked, caught off guard. "No?" Rowan clenched his fists. "I don't need charity. Cade's eyes darkened slightly. This isn't charity. It's a second chance. Rowan laughed bitterly, shaking his head. I had my chance, remember? And when I lost it, everyone turned their backs. Including you. Cade flinched at that. He didn't deny it. Because it was true. When Rowan's bad investment crashed and burned all those years ago, his business partners had cut ties immediately. Investors pulled out. His reputation crumbled. Cade hadn't spoken to him since. Until now. Cade sighed. You're right, he admitted. I didn't fight for you back then. And I regret that. Rowan exhaled sharply. He wasn't angry anymore, at least, not in the same way he had been back then. He was tired. Too many years had passed. Too much had happened. He wasn't that man anymore. I don't belong in that world, Rowan murmured. It's not for me. Cade studied him for a long moment. Then, his gaze softened. Then tell me what you do want. Rowan hesitated. No one had asked him that in a long time. What did he want? For years, his only goal had been survival. Shelter. Food. Another day. But now. His eyes drifted to the little girl, still sitting in the chair across the room, hugging her half-burned teddy bear. She had been in real danger, trapped in that fire, helpless. Just like he had been, once. And no one had come for him. His chest tightened. But he had come for her. He had made a difference. Something inside him stirred, a feeling he hadn't had in years. Purpose. Cade noticed the shift in his expression. Rowan? Rowan swallowed. If I take your offer, he exhaled slowly. I don't want a fancy job. I don't want a corporate position. I don't need money. Cade frowned. Then what? Rowan's voice was quiet, but steady. I want to help people. Cade stilled. Rowan looked down at his scarred hands, remembering cold nights, empty stomachs, the feeling of being invisible. There are people out there like me, Rowan said. People who've been forgotten. People who need help but won't ask for it, because they think no one will care. Cade nodded slowly. And you want to be the one who cares. Rowan met his eyes. Yeah. Silence stretched between them. Then, Cade let out a breath, something like relief crossing his features. I can make that happen, Cade said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. And this time, Rowan? I won't turn my back. Rowan let out a slow exhale. For the first time in years, he believed him. Rowan sat in silence for a long time. The hospital room felt smaller now, the air heavier. Not because of the pain in his body, but because of the decision in front of him. Cade Arlo, the man who had once walked away from him, was offering a second chance. But not in the way Rowan expected. Not with money. Not with power. But with purpose. Rowan glanced at the little girl, still curled up in the chair, her tiny hands wrapped around her half-burned teddy bear. She had been through so much. But she had survived. Because he had made a choice. And now, here he was, at another crossroad. Could he really do this? Could he really start over? Cade leaned forward, watching him closely. Rowan, I know it's a lot. And I know you probably don't trust me. But I mean it when I say, you don't have to do this alone. Rowan exhaled slowly. It's not about trust, Cade. It's about, what happens next. Cade nodded. You said you wanted to help people. I can make that happen. Rowan frowned. How? Cade hesitated, then pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times before turning it toward Rowan. It was a news article. Rowan's name was in the headline. Homeless man risks his life to save millionaire's daughter, a hero without a home. Rowan's stomach twisted. He scrolled down, seeing pictures of himself being pulled from the burning wreckage. The article had thousands of comments. People calling him a hero. People demanding that someone help him. People finally seeing him. Rowan's hands clenched. I didn't do it for attention. I know, Cade said softly. But people are listening now. We can use this to do some real good. Rowan looked up sharply. We? Cade nodded. I've already started working on something. A foundation. Resources for people like you, people who have fallen through the cracks. Shelters. Job programs. Real help, not just a handout. Rowan's breath caught. Why? Cade's expression softened. Because I should have done something years ago. Silence stretched between them. Rowan stared at the screen, at his own face staring back at him. For so long, he had been invisible. Forgotten. But now, people knew his name. People cared. And for the first time in years, he had a chance to make a difference. Rowan closed his eyes, exhaling sharply. Then he looked at Cade and said two words that changed everything. I'm in. Rowan stepped out of the hospital for the first time in weeks. The crisp morning air felt different against his skin. Lighter. Freer. For years, he had lived on the streets, barely getting by. His life had been a cycle of hunger, cold, and invisibility. No one had seen him. No one had cared. And now? Now, the world knew his name. Reporters had tried to swarm the hospital doors when word got out that he was awake. They wanted his story. They wanted to define him, to make him into something he wasn't sure he wanted to be. But Rowan didn't care about the cameras. He cared about what came next. Beside him, Cade Arlo adjusted his tie, looking out over the city skyline. You ready for this? Rowan took a slow breath. I don't know. But I'm doing it anyway. Cade nodded, something like pride flickering in his eyes. Good answer. They walked in silence for a moment, heading toward Cade's car. But just before they got in, a small voice called out. Wait. Rowan turned just in time for a small blur of pink to crash into his leg. The little girl, Cade's daughter, wrapped her tiny arms around him, hugging him tightly. Rowan froze. She looked up at him, her big brown eyes filled with something he wasn't used to seeing. Pure, unwavering trust. Are you leaving? She asked. Rowan swallowed, glancing at Cade, then back at her. I'll be around. She hesitated. Then, carefully, she held something out to him. Her teddy bear. The same one she had clutched that night in the fire. Rowan blinked. What's this for? She smiled. So you don't forget. His throat tightened. She had no idea how much that meant. Kneeling down, he took the bear gently. Thank you. The little girl beamed. Rowan stood up, gripping the bear for a second before tucking it under his arm. Then, with one last look at the hospital, the place where his life had almost ended and truly begun again, he stepped into the car. A new future awaited him. A second chance not just for himself, but for others like him. As they pulled away, Rowan glanced down at the bear, then out at the city beyond. Maybe life wasn't about how far you fell. Maybe it was about what you did once you got back up.